They called it a curse, though she never asked to be born with it. Clara had grown up knowing the whispers, the way neighbors stared when her family mentioned marriage prospects, the way pity draped itself over every conversation like a heavy shawl, in the small frontier town where women were expected to bear children as their only proof of worth. Being infertile was not just a private sorrow, it was a public humiliation. When her parents arranged her marriage to a widower out west, most believed it was not out of love but a transaction, a way to rid the family of their burden. The whispers followed her all the way to the station, the knowing smirks of women, and the hollow encouragements of men, cutting deeper than any blade. She rode in the wagon with her hands clenched tight on a small leather bag, knowing this union was meant to shame her, to send her away from the only home she had ever known and remind her that she was less in the eyes of everyone around her. Yet she had no choice, women seldom did. The journey was long, the dusty plains stretching endlessly, and when at last she arrived at the ranch where her new husband lived, she found a man not cruel or mocking, but distant, carved from stone like the land itself. His name was James, a cowboy who had buried his first wife years earlier, a man who kept to himself, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat and by losses too deep to name. At first he seemed hardly to notice her, as though she were another tool set down on the porch, something useful but unnecessary. Clara expected scorn, expected him to remind her of the shame everyone else had hung around her shoulders, but instead he gave her silence, and that silence was heavier than words. For weeks she worked quietly, tending to the cabin, mending what needed mending, cooking with care. Though he rarely spoke more than a sentence or two, she lay awake at night hearing the coyotes in the distance, wondering if this would be her fate, to live as a ghost in a stranger's home, marked by the one thing she could never give. But then small things began to shift. James would come in from the fields and notice the way she'd organized the pantry. He'd pause to watch her brushing dust from her skirt as she tended the small garden she'd started by the porch. One evening, when her hands were raw from hauling water, he took the bucket from her without a word and carried it inside himself. It was a small gesture, but in it Clara felt something stir, something dangerous and hopeful. The town had sent her here to be forgotten, to be shamed, but here was a man who looked at her as though she was more than a broken promise. And when the first storm of the season came, fierce and raging against the walls of the cabin, James found her trembling in her sleep and pulled a blanket around her shoulders, sitting by her side until dawn. That was when Clara realized perhaps fate had sent her to this place not as punishment, but as the beginning of a story she had never dared dream. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like the prairie flowers that only bloom after rain. Clara found herself no longer shrinking beneath James's silence, but listening for the rare moments when his voice would carry warmth. He began teaching her how to ride the horses, steadying her hands on the reins, his touch firm but careful, as though he knew she carried a fragility others had always mocked. She found herself laughing one morning when her bonnet flew off in the wind, and for the first time James laughed too, the sound rusty but real, like a door long closed finally swinging open. The town noticed the change. When Clara walked beside him at market, the whispers began again, but this time with confusion. How could the cowboy, the man who had sworn never to remarry, the man who turned his back on society's gossip, walk so proudly with a woman they all pitied? Yet James didn't flinch. When a bold neighbor made a cruel remark about her barrenness, James set his hand on Clara's shoulder and spoke firmly. "She is mine, and I need nothing else." The words silenced. More than the man who'd spoken, them they silenced. Years of shame that had clung to Clara's heart. For the first time she stood taller, knowing she was not defined by what she could not give, but by the love she had found in a place no one believed she would. And love grew there quietly but powerfully, not needing children to prove its worth, not needing society's approval to be real. James taught Clara that the strength of a woman was not in what others demanded from her, but in the fire she carried inside, the fire that had kept her going when the world turned its back. On long evenings when the sun bled across the horizon and the land seemed endless, they sat together on the porch, speaking of dreams, of the life they were building. Clara discovered that she had not been cast away. She had been set free, free to love and be loved in a way few ever knew. The woman sent to shame became the woman cherished above all others. And in that cabin on the edge of the wild frontier, she found not exile, but a home carved out of tenderness and courage. Their story was not the one society had written for them, but it was the only one that mattered, because it was written by their hearts. And to you listening now, if this story touched you, if Clara's journey from shame to love reminds you that everyone is worthy of a place in this world, then I ask you to stay with us, to follow more stories like this. Hit that subscribe button, because together we'll keep telling tales that prove love always finds its way, even in the harshest lands, even in the most unexpected hearts.